She hid the inheritance letter until I opened the safe she forgot I owned. The moment my eyes fell on that envelope, sealed with my father's handwriting, my world split in two. Everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my future, even my own worth shattered in an instant. That letter wasn't just paper. It was proof. It was betrayal. It was the truth she never wanted me to see. And it all began long before the safe, long before the discovery back when I still believed my life was perfect. From the outside looking in, people thought we had it all. Friends envied us. Neighbors whispered about how perfect we seemed. Family members told me how lucky I was, how any man would kill for the life I had. And I believed them, or at least I tried to. Because the truth was, appearances can be painted like a portrait smooth on the canvas, but hiding cracks underneath. And behind the doors of our house, the cracks were already spreading. At first, it was little things, small enough that if I mentioned them to anyone, they'd shrug and say, "That's normal." Every couple has quirks. She liked handling the bills. She liked sorting the mail. She liked being the one who filled out forms and filed documents. At first, I told myself it was harmless, maybe even helpful. Some people can't stand paperwork, but she thrived on it. She said it made her feel in control, like she was protecting us from stress. So, when she'd take the mail straight from the box, I didn't argue. When she'd wave me off from looking over our bank statements, I thought, fine, that's her thing. But harmless habits have a way of turning into walls. And, over time, I realized those walls weren't protecting us. They were shutting me out. It became a pattern. If I asked about a bill, she'd sigh and say, "Don't worry about it. I've got it." If I opened an envelope, she'd snatch it back with a too bright smile. "Oh, that's just junk." If I suggested we sit down together and review our finances, she laughed and touched my arm. "Honey, numbers stress you out. That's why I handle it." And, at first, I let it slide. Because isn't that what marriage is supposed to be? Compromise? Trust? But, little by little, that trust began to feel less like a partnership and more like a surrender. And then came the first real red flag. It was late on a Thursday evening. She'd dropped her purse on the counter while she went upstairs to shower. I walked past it, not even thinking, until a folded slip of paper caught my eye. I wish I could say I looked away. I wish I could say I respected her privacy. But something in me froze, and before I could stop myself, I picked it up. Across the top, in bold black letters, were 3 words that stopped me cold. Bank of Westfield. We didn't have an account there. We had one joint account, different bank, different town. I knew every detail of it. So, what was this? I stared at the slip like it was a piece of evidence at a crime scene. My stomach dropped. When she came back down, a towel wrapped around her hair, I asked casually, "Hey, what's this?" and held it up. Her face shifted for just a second. Barely a flicker, but I saw it, the mask slipping. Then she snatched it from my hand with a laugh that sounded too sharp. "Oh, that? It's nothing. Just a mistake. Wrong mail." But I knew what I saw. That night, when she thought I was asleep, I heard her downstairs, pacing across the kitchen floor. I heard the faint rustle of paper, the sound of drawers opening and closing. When I came down the next morning, the counter was spotless, like nothing had ever been there. And from then on, I noticed more. The hidden key tucked inside her jewelry box, the way she guarded her phone like it contained state secrets. The nights she'd stay up late at the table, face lit by the cold glow of her screen, papers spread around her like a fortress. When I asked what she was working on, She always had an answer. Insurance forms. Work stuff. Don't worry, you wouldn't understand. And I let it go. Again. But letting it go didn't quiet the voice in my head. If anything, it grew louder. Because trust isn't supposed to feel like suspicion. Love isn't supposed to feel like a secret you're not allowed to touch. I wanted to believe she was protecting us, that all of her secrecy was in service of something noble. But late at night, lying awake beside her, I couldn't shake the thought. What if she isn't protecting us? What if she's protecting herself from me? I told myself every marriage has quirks. Every couple has things they don't share. Maybe this was ours. But deep down, I knew. Privacy wasn't the problem. Secrecy was. And her secrecy was only just beginning. I kept telling myself it was harmless until the day I uncovered the first undeniable lie. The thing about lies is that they rarely start big. They don't storm through the front door shouting their presence. No, they slip in quietly, like a draft through a cracked window. Small, harmless looking, easy to ignore, and that's exactly what I did. I ignored them. The first was the bank. Slip. That piece of paper with the bold black letters, Bank of Westfield. I told myself maybe she was right. Maybe it was just junk mail. Maybe it had nothing to do with us at all. She had laughed so easily when she brushed it off. Too easily. Still, I swallowed my doubts and let it go. But once you notice one crack, you start to see others. And once I started paying attention, they became impossible to ignore. It was in the way she hovered by the front door whenever the mail truck pulled up. If I happened to bring it in first, she was right there, reaching out with that bright, practiced smile, saying, "Oh, thank you. Love, you'll sort this." And just like that, the envelopes disappeared into her hands. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. Who really cares who opens the bills? But then I realized I never saw those envelopes again. It was in her phone. She used to leave it lying face up on the counter, forgotten for hours. Now it never left her side. If it buzzed, she was on it in an instant, fingers flying across the screen, shoulders tight. If I walked into the room, she'd tilt the phone away or lock it before I could glimpse the screen. And then there was the key. One afternoon, while digging through her jewelry box to find a watch she wanted repaired, I noticed it. A small brass key tucked beneath a tangle of necklaces, not labeled, not attached to anything. I picked it up without thinking, curious. She walked in at that exact moment, her eyes snapping to my hand. She didn't yell. She didn't accuse. She just smiled too quickly and said, "Oh, that? Just an old diary key." Then she plucked it from my fingers and slid it back under the pile. Her tone was too sweet, too rehearsed. And the way her eyes flickered told me she wasn't telling the truth. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the moment over and over. Who hides a diary key under jewelry? And why did she look so alarmed? I tried to brush it aside, but a week later, curiosity gnawed at me. She had gone upstairs early, complaining of a migraine. I waited until her breathing settled, then crept downstairs. My hands shook as I pulled out the jewelry box. I opened it, heart pounding like a drum. The key was gone. In its place was a folded slip of paper. I unfolded it carefully. It was a receipt, the kind that comes from a carbon copy pad. The name at the top hit me like a lightning strike. Westfield Security and Storage. Personal safe. The date was recent. A safe. She had a safe, and she had never told me about it. I sat there frozen, staring at the receipt. Why would she need a safe? If it were for jewelry or insurance documents or something innocent, why hide it from me? Why bury the key like a secret treasure? I tucked the receipt back exactly where I'd found it, every muscle tense as though she might walk in at any moment. My chest felt tight, my pulse hammering as I closed the jewelry box. The next morning, I decided to test her. Over breakfast, I asked casually, "Hey, do we have a safe deposit box or something?" I found a receipt for Westfield. She didn't even blink. She looked up from her coffee, smiled, and said, "Oh, that? I thought we might need one for insurance papers, but it turned out we didn't. I must be forgotten about the receipt." Her answer was smooth. Too smooth. But as she lifted her mug, I saw it. Her hand trembled, just slightly. That was the moment I knew she was lying. From then on, everything looked different. She started leaving the house more often. At first, it was simple errands, groceries, dry cleaning, prescriptions. But the times never matched the excuses. A quick trip for milk stretched into 2 hours. A pharmacy run somehow took an entire afternoon. One Tuesday, she said she was going to the store. 10 minutes later, I got in my car and drove past the grocery out of instinct. Her car wasn't there. My stomach knotted as I circled the block. Then I saw it. Parked neatly in front of a low, nondescript building on the edge of town. The bold blue sign above the door read, "Westfield Security and Storage." I slowed the car, my grip tight on the wheel. Through the glass doors, I saw her. My wife. She was holding a folder against her chest as she walked briskly to her car. She didn't see me. I drove home in silence, my thoughts spinning so fast they made me dizzy. By the time she came through the door an hour later carrying a grocery bag, she smiled like nothing had happened. "The lines were insane," she said. She kissed me lightly on the cheek as though she hadn't just lied to me again. That night, I lay in bed listening to her breathe. Calm, steady, peaceful. And I stared at the ceiling, wide awake, unable to shake the image of her walking out of that building with that folder. What was inside? Why was she hiding it? I told myself maybe there was an explanation. Maybe it was innocent. But my gut told me otherwise. And then came the lie that sealed everything. One evening, I picked up the house phone to call an old friend. We almost never used it anymore, but it still sat on the table in the hallway. When I pressed the call button, the screen lit up with the last dialed number. I almost ignored it until curiosity tugged at me. I wrote it down, then punched it into my cell. My heart stopped. It was the direct line to Westfield Security. The next morning, I asked her about it. Calm, casual. "Hey, did you call Westfield recently?" She didn't hesitate. She smiled, poured herself coffee, and said, "Oh yes, I must have called them about renter's insurance. Don't you remember? We talked about it, but we hadn't. Not once." And that was it. The mask slipped. The bank slip, the hidden key, the safe, the errands that weren't errands. The phone call she claimed I'd forgotten. Individually, each one could have been explained away, but together they told a story I could no longer ignore. She was hiding something from me, something big, and deep down I knew exactly where it was. Inside that safe. What I didn't realize then was that the answer was tied to my father, his warnings, his foresight, and a letter that was meant only for me. When I think back on the cracks that appeared in my marriage, I realize something important now. My father had warned me. Not directly, not in so many words, but in the lessons he left behind. His voice was an echo that I hadn't listened to closely enough until it was almost too late. My father wasn't a wealthy man by the world's standards. He didn't drive luxury cars or wear suits tailored to perfection. He worked with his hands, managed a modest home, and lived a life that was more substance than show. But he was smarter than I ever gave him credit for when I was younger. He believed in planning, in being cautious, in looking beyond the surface. Document everything, he used to say. Paper is memory that can't be twisted. I remember rolling my eyes at him when I was a teenager. Who cared about documents and receipts when life was happening outside? But he wasn't talking about clutter. He was talking about protection. He believed that trust was precious, but blind trust was dangerous. People will smile at you, he told me once, but a smile doesn't always mean they're on your side. Look at what they do when they think you're not watching. Those words came back to me now, in sharp detail, every time I thought about the hidden safe, because my father hadn't just left me with memories. He had left me something else, something more concrete. I knew this because I'd heard whispers about it from relatives after his funeral. One of my uncles had pulled me aside, his voice low, and said, "Your dad left you something important. Make sure you find it." At the time, I was too consumed by grief to think clearly, too busy holding myself together to ask questions. But now, years later, as I sat in a house filled with my wife's secrets, that memory hit me like a hammer. What had my father left me? Why hadn't I ever received it? And why did my wife suddenly have so much interest in controlling every scrap of paper connected to his estate? I replayed those early days after his passing. I remembered letters arriving, envelopes addressed to me. Back then, my wife had insisted on helping. "You don't need to deal with all this while you're grieving," she had said gently, slipping the envelopes into a neat stack. "You'll handle the boring stuff." I had been grateful. Naive. I hadn't realized then how easily someone could bury the truth in the name of kindness. And then there was the conversation I'd overheard between her and a relative of Minna, my cousin, to be exact. I'd walked into the kitchen one holiday years ago, just in time to hear my cousin say, "Did he ever get the letter?" My wife's reply had been so quick, so casual, that I didn't question it then. "Oh yes, don't worry, he got it." But I hadn't. I never held any such letter in my hands. At the time, I brushed it off, assuming he'd misunderstood. Now, that memory burned in me like a warning flare. The pieces began to fit together, even if the picture was still blurry. My father had left something for me. A letter, and I had never seen it. That's when my suspicion turned into certainty. That safe wasn't just holding bank papers or jewelry. It wasn't about insurance forms or private keepsakes. No, it was about my father, about whatever he had left behind for me, something my wife had worked very hard to keep hidden. For days, I wrestled with it. Part of me wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation, that maybe she had stored it away for safekeeping and simply forgot to mention it. But deep down, I knew better. She hadn't forgotten. She had concealed it. And the more I thought about my father, the more I realized just how deliberate his actions always were. He was the kind of man who thought 10 steps ahead. If he had left me a letter, it wasn't a casual goodbye. It was important, maybe even life-changing. The idea consumed me. I found myself staring at old photos of him, studying his face like he might whisper the answer from beyond the grave. I could almost hear him say, "Don't let anyone else decide your future. It's yours and yours alone." The memory of his words gave me clarity. The safe wasn't hers to own. The contents weren't hers to control. And the inheritance, whatever it was, wasn't hers to take. That's when the fear turned into determination. I didn't just want to know what was in that safe. I needed to know. Because if my father had taken the time to leave me something, to put his thoughts on paper and address them to me, then it wasn't just money or property at stake. It was my father's final message, his last act of protection. And I couldn't let that be stolen from me. The cracks in my marriage were no longer invisible. And soon, she wasn't just hiding mail or errands, she was pushing me to sign papers I didn't understand. That's when the betrayal turned from suspicion into a trap. After I realized my father had left me something, the air in my marriage shifted. It wasn't just tension anymore, it was pressure. Subtle, constant, deliberate pressure. She didn't yell, she didn't demand. That wasn't her style. Instead, she wore me down with charm and timing. She was clever like that. It started with casual conversations over dinner. She'd bring up finances in the middle of small talk. We should really think about consolidating accounts, you know. Make things easier. Or it would be smart if we signed some papers to protect ourselves legally. Couples do that all the time. I'd nod, half listening, because the way she framed it always sounded reasonable. But then she started leaving documents on the kitchen table, stacked neatly in folders, highlighted in places she wanted me to sign. At first, I skimmed them. They looked like routine things: insurance updates, mortgage adjustments, bank authorizations. The kind of boring paperwork that eats up a Saturday afternoon. And she was so reassuring. It's all standard. Just sign where I've flagged it. I already took care of the details, and I almost did. Almost. But my father's voice echoed in the back of my head. Document everything. Read everything. Don't let anyone sign your future for you. So I began to slow down. I started reading, and the more I read, the more my stomach tightened. One document shifted ownership of a small piece of land into both our names. But that land had been mine. A gift from my father. Another document gave her the authority to make financial decisions if I were unavailable. At first, that sounded like a harmless precaution, but then I noticed the fine, print-broad language that gave her sweeping control. When I questioned her, she laughed it off. "Oh, come on. It's just a formality. Do you really think I'd ever do something without you?" Her eyes sparkled when she said it, her hand sliding across the table to cover mine, and for a moment I almost believed her. But the timing was too perfect, the pressure too deliberate. She would hand me a document right after a stressful day when my guard was down. Or she'd mention important signatures late at night when I was half asleep. If I hesitated, she'd sigh, kiss me, and murmur, "I just want to protect us. Don't you trust me?" That was her weapon, trust. She wielded it like a blade, cutting into my doubts. The worst moment came one Saturday morning. She woke me up early, cheerful, and pancakes already on the table. She set a steaming cup of coffee in front of me and slid a folder across the wood. "Just one last thing, love. Then we're all set. Everything will be smooth sailing." I opened the folder. Inside were 3 documents. Each one bristled with legal language. One stood out. It mentioned collateral for our mortgage. My father's land. My chest tightened. "Why is this here?" I asked, pointing at the section. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed just slightly. "It's just a technicality. The bank wants more security." Well, still own the land, of course. This is just paperwork. But I wasn't convinced. My father had worked hard to leave that land for me. It was more than dirt and grass. It was his legacy. And here it was, reduced to a bargaining chip in a stack of papers I barely understood. I pushed the folder back toward her. I'm not signing this. Her expression froze for half a second before she laughed, the sound brittle. Don't be dramatic. Everyone signs these things. You're overthinking it. Maybe I was, but maybe I wasn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing her face, the way it tightened before she forced a smile. I kept hearing her words. You're overthinking it. And I kept remembering the receipt for the safe, the phone call to Westfield, the folder she had carried out of that building. I knew, deep down, that signing those papers would be a mistake, a permanent one. The next week, she grew bolder. She started bringing the documents upstairs, placing them on my nightstand like a bedtime story. She'd kiss me, whisper, "Just look them over tomorrow. It's really nothing, I promise." But the more she pushed, the more I resisted. And the more I resisted, the sharper her patience grew. Her smile turned tighter. Her sighs turned louder. Her voice, once soft and sweet, began to carry an edge. "I don't understand why you're being so difficult. I'm trying to protect us, and you're acting like the enemy." That wordin' my stuck with me. Because that's exactly how it felt. I wasn't her partner anymore. I was an obstacle, something to get past. And then it hit me. She didn't just want my signature. She needed it. Why? What was hidden in that fine print that gave her so much urgency? What was in that safe that connected to all of this? My father's voice echoed again. "Look at what they do when they think you're not watching." And she had been doing plenty. I realized then that the battle wasn't about the papers in front of me. It was about control, about whether I would hand over the last pieces of my father's legacy without even realizing it. And I swore to myself I wouldn't. But resistance has consequences, and the more I pushed back, the more desperate she became. Until one night, I caught her making a mistake that would finally crack her mask wide open. For weeks, the documents she pushed across the table had eaten at me. For weeks, the safe she kept secret gnawed at the back of my mind. I felt trapped, like a man circling a locked door, knowing that everything I needed was on the other side. Then one night, while digging through an old filing cabinet in the garage, I found it buried under tax records and car manuals I hadn't touched in years. A yellowed purchase slip, Westfield Security and Storage, safe rental. And at the top, in faded ink, was my name. Not hers, mine. I sat back hard in the chair, the paper trembling in my hands. My name. She had acted like it was hers, like she alone controlled it. But she had slipped up. She'd used my name to register the safe, maybe thinking I'd never notice, maybe thinking I'd never remember. But here it was, undeniable proof. That safe was mine. Even better taped to the back of the receipt was a small index card with numbers scribbled in my own handwriting. The combination. A spare I must have written down years ago and forgotten. My pulse hammered in my ears. I had the key she thought she'd hidden, and now I had the combination. The walls she built were crumbling, brick by brick. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to her even breathing beside me, my mind racing. Should I wait? Should I confront her? Should I bring in a lawyer first? A dozen voices fought in my head, but one voice cut through them all, my father's. Don't let anyone else decide your future. It's yours and yours alone. By midnight, I knew what I had to do. I slipped out of bed carefully, my movements slow and deliberate. I didn't even turn on the lights. I pulled on jeans, grabbed my jacket, and tucked the spare combination card into my pocket. I didn't look back at her. If I did, I might have lost my nerve. The streets were empty as I drove across town. Every red light felt like an eternity. Every shadow in the rearview mirror made my chest tighten. By the time I pulled into the deserted parking lot of Westfield Security, my palms were slick with sweat. The building loomed ahead, quiet and unassuming. Just rows of metal doors, locked tight. I stepped out of the car and listened. Nothing but the faint hum of streetlights. I walked to the entrance, slid the brass key into the lock, and turned. The door clicked open. My breath hitched. Inside, the air was cool and stale. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, buzzing faintly. My footsteps echoed as I walked down the corridor, past rows of safes. My eyes scanned the numbers until they landed on mine. There it was. My safe. I crouched down, heart pounding, and pressed the dial with shaking fingers. The numbers on the card blurred as sweat dripped into my eyes, but I forced myself to focus. Left, right, left again. The final turn clicked. For a moment I just sat there, my hand hovering over the handle, frozen. My entire body trembled. Whatever was inside was the truth, and the truth has a way of changing everything. I gripped the handle and pulled. The safe creaked open slowly. Inside was a single manila folder, thick with papers. And sitting on top of the folder was an envelope, sealed with my father's handwriting across the front. My chest constricted. His handwriting, bold, steady, familiar, to my son. I reached for it with both hands like it might vanish if I didn't hold it tight enough. The paper felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the weight of everything I hadn't known until now. And then I saw something else. The manila folder beneath it wasn't my father's. The neat black letters across the tab stopped me cold. It was her handwriting, my wife's, my father's words, sealed in an envelope meant for me, hidden under her folder. Years of deception stacked in one safe. One place she thought I'd never look. The room seemed to tilt around me. My knees went weak. I sat back hard on the cold floor, the envelope pressed to my chest. She had hidden my father's final words from me, and she had almost gotten away with it. Her handwriting is on the folder, my father's on the letter, and the moment I opened that envelope, his voice came back to life. I sat on the cold floor of the storage corridor with the envelope in my hands, the metal door of the safe yawning open like a mouth that had finally decided to speak. My father's handwriting stared back at me, steady, unmistakable name written the way only he wrote it. The paper felt warm from my grip, but my fingers were numb. I slid a thumb under the seal and paused. For a second I just listened to the building breathe. The thin hum of the fluorescents, the faint tick of the cooling vents, my own pulse drumming in my ears. Then I opened it. The first thing I saw was the date written a few weeks before he died, and beneath it, a salutation so simple it pressed a knot into my throat. Son. The letters were careful, deliberate, like he had measured every inch of ink. I unfolded the pages, and as I began to read, it felt like he stepped into that hallway with me. His voice wasn't gone. It had just been waiting. He didn't begin with money. He began with me. He wrote about the day I learned to ride a bike, the time I split my lip on the sidewalk and refused to cry, the way I used to line up my toy soldiers and insist on counting them twice. He remembered the small things no one else would remember, the kind of details that prove love without having to announce it. And then, gently, he turned the corner. I want to talk about responsibility, he wrote. Not the kind that makes people puff their chests, the kind that lets you sleep at night. He explained that for years he had put aside what he could, little by little, and that those small decisions had grown. He didn't use grand words. He didn't brag. He just laid out the truth with the same plain honesty he used when teaching me how to change a tire. There was an inheritance. It existed. It was for me. He told me where it was held and why he arranged it the way he did. The assets were placed in a trust structured to remain my separate property no matter who stood beside me. He described the trustee, the terms, and the contingencies. If I were married, the trust would not merge. If I were pressured to sign, the trust would not yield. If anyone interfered with notices, the trustee was obliged to contact me directly, and if they couldn't reach me, to contact a backup listed on a sealed card. He had thought of lock after lock after lock, not because he was suspicious of the world for sport, but because he had lived long enough to know how quickly people can start speaking a different language when money enters the room. Halfway down the first page, the words sharpened. If someone you love ever tells you not to worry about it, he wrote. Trust is a gift, not a shortcut. I could feel him looking at me through the paper. He spoke about secrecy and how it never grows in bright rooms. He told me that grief makes decent people careless, and careless people easy to steer. He apologized for the timing. He hated leaving instructions instead of conversations. But he said he would rather be careful from the grave than careless from the recliner. I laughed once, softly, because it sounded exactly like him. On the second page, he shifted from principle to procedure. He listed account names, contact numbers, and a chain of custody for the documents that should have reached me after his passing. There should have been 2 notices. He said, owned from the firm holding the trust, and one from the county clerk about mineral rights associated with a parcel of land he had quietly bought years before. If I hadn't received them, he wrote, it meant one of 3 things: a clerical mistake, a postal mishap, or interference. He didn't accuse. He didn't sneer. He just set out the possibilities like items on a workbench and asked me to look at them with both eyes open. Then the line that turned my spine to ice. If you are reading this later than you should have, it is because someone made sure you did. He underlined someone. Not twice, not angrily, just once enough to make the page thrum. He told me to keep this letter in my custody and to make certified copies. He told me to check dates, envelopes, and barcodes, to photograph everything before anyone had a chance to explain it away. Paper is memory that can't be sweet-talked, he wrote, echoing the mantra I had rolled my eyes at as a boy. I turned to the next page and found attachments clipped neatly to the bottom. A photocopy of the trust's declaration of separate property, a notarized letter from the trustee confirming the protections, and a summary page in my father's hand that translated the legal language into something even a tired, grieving son could understand. If you sign under pressure, he wrote, that is not consent. If you assign what you don't want to assign, call it back. If you are told something is routine, ask who benefits. It wasn't paranoia, it was a map. He didn't stop there. He warned me about how manipulation often wears politeness like a costume. He described the exact moves it uses, suggesting you're too stressed to read, offering to handle the dull things, telling you're overreacting when you ask for time. He told me that predators don't always snarl. Sometimes they make pancakes, smile kindly, and slide a pen across the table. It made my stomach twist, not because I needed convincing, but because I had lived it line for line without having the words to call it what it was. As I kept reading, the pages tightened into a blueprint. Call this person. Check this record. Ask for this log. He named the bank relationship manager who had helped open the trust's accounts. He listed the county filing number for the land deed and noted a recorded interest from an exploration company that had sent inquiries about mineral rights. He provided the name of a second attorney in case the first one retires or forgets his hat. He joked along with a sealed index of document numbers that could be verified without anyone else's permission. It wasn't just an inheritance. It was a fortress designed by a man who built cabinets square by measuring twice. By the fourth page, I reached a paragraph that made the fluorescent light above me seem suddenly loud. He described a scenario: a spouse or partner intercepting mail while I mourned, insisting I let them handle the bureaucracy, suggesting that my father had left only small, sentimental things. He wrote that if anyone discouraged me from reading or delayed me from receiving what was addressed to me, I should treat it not as kindness, but as a lock I hadn't turned yet. Ask to see everything, he wrote. If they love you, they'll bring you the keys. I paused there, swallowing hard, and looked at the safe again, the metal face still open, the manila folder below the letter with her handwriting on the tab. I thought of the key in the jewelry box, the late-night trips, the folder she hugged to her chest in the Westfield parking lot. My chest felt hollow, like I was breathing through paper. He had predicted the shape of the storm and left me an umbrella stitched with instructions. At the end of the letter, he gave me something I didn't expect: permission. You don't owe anyone your confusion, he wrote. If you feel rushed, slow down. If you feel pushed, plant your feet. If they call you ungrateful for protecting what I left you, let them be offended. I didn't spend my life saving so someone else could spend your voice. I stared at that line until the words blurred. For the first time since I opened the door to the corridor, the cold concrete under me felt like ground again. Tucked behind the last page, in a small inner envelope, was a list in his blocky print. It contained dates and tracking numbers for the notices that should have reached me, along with the names of the couriers who signed them over. And then there was another sheet shorter, narrower, written with the kind of caution you use when speaking near a sleeping animal. People who contacted me about you, he titled it. He listed a banker I recognized, a clerk I didn't, and one name that made my breath stop. My wife's maiden name, followed by an initial, a date, and the phrase inquiry re estate correspondence. I read it again to be sure I wasn't bending the meaning to fit my fear. Same letters, same date. The ink had not learned how to lie after his death. She had made an inquiry about my estate mail before the notices went missing from my life and migrated into hers. Suddenly, the missing pieces aligned like magnets, snapping together in my hands. I kept turning pages, looking for some impossible alternate explanation, some footnote he had left to let me write this off as a coincidence. There wasn't one. There were copies of envelopes addressed to me at our home, certified mail receipts with tracking that ended in an entry I had never seen, and a note in his margin. If you didn't receive this, someone else did. On the back, he'd written the simplest instruction in the whole packet. Keep this letter on you. I folded the pages carefully, pressing out the air as if the past might leak, and slid them back into the envelope. I didn't put the envelope back into the safe. I put it inside my jacket, next to my heart, where no practiced smile could reach without meeting bone. The hallway suddenly felt differentless, like a place I had snuck into, and more like a place I had been invited to all along. I took the manila folder with her handwriting, too, not to read there, in the hum of the lights, but to secure, to understand on my terms. I looked once more into the safe and at the dial I had turned with hands that had learned to hesitate, and then I closed the door. The click sounded like a sentence ending. When I stepped out into the night, the air was sharp and honest, the kind that wakes you up from the inside. I wasn't just holding paper. I was holding a map out of a maze I hadn't known I was walking. I started the car, set the envelope on the passenger seat as if it were a person, and watched it in the corner of my eye all the way home. By the time I pulled into the driveway, my fear had been replaced by something colder and cleaner. Not rage, not yet. A resolve that didn't need to raise its voice. I cut the engine, pocketed the envelope, and sat in the dark, listening to the house breathe. Somewhere inside, she slept like secrecy was a mattress. Somewhere inside was the rest of the proof my father had prepared me to collect. He hadn't only left me money. He had left me a way to see. And he had left me one last gift I hadn't expected to open tonight. The certainty that I wasn't crazy. That my memory hadn't failed me. That love doesn't require blindness to qualify as love. It was clarity, and it filled me to the brim. He included proof and names. One of them was hers. When I finally stepped back into the house that night, the silence wrapped around me like a lie I had already unmasked. She was upstairs, sleeping, unaware that the fortress she had built around her secret was crumbling piece by piece. I didn't go to bed. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with the letter, the manila folder, and a notebook. If my father had left me a map, I was going to follow every line. The folder in her handwriting was my first stop. It was thicker than I expected, and when I opened it, the smell of paper and toner hit me like a vault of stolen time. Inside were bank statements, clipped together with careful precision. Some bore my name, some hers, some joint. But the pattern was clear. Withdrawals timed with deposits I had never known existed. Transfers routed through accounts I'd never seen. The balances shifted like shadows, as if she had been trying to keep everything just below the level of my curiosity. I turned page after page, and each one told the same story, money redirected, letters missing, copies filed where I would never look. She hadn't just hidden the letter. She had built an entire ecosystem of control around it. Near the bottom of the folder, I found correspondence. Official letters, stamped with the logo of the very firm my father had named in his instructions. Some were addressed to me, bold and unmistakable. But they had never reached me. The postmarks were old, the barcodes intact, the envelopes torn open with a precision that suggested habit, not accident. She had intercepted them, opened them, and filed them here, under her name. My throat tightened as I traced the dates. The notices my father had warned me about correspondence from the trust, notices from the county clerk we're all here, not lost in the mail, not forgotten by bureaucracy, stolen out of my reach and locked in a safe I had supposedly never owned. And then I saw the pattern deepen. Folded between financial notices were letters from a bank officer I didn't know. They weren't casual updates. They were inquiries, follow-ups, and confirmations of conversations she must have had without me. Each one referred to questions about disbursement, authority, or beneficiary rights. She hadn't just read about my inheritance. She had tried to maneuver it, probe it, reframe it. I pulled out one envelope and read it 3 times. It referenced mineral rights connected to the parcel of land my father had left me. The same mineral rights my father had warned about, the ones that had already attracted interest from an energy company. The letter didn't ask me anything. It confirmed a discussion about transferring documentation that required my signature. My signature that she had been pressing me to give, disguised inside those routine stacks of boring paperwork. My father's voice roared through my memory. If they say it's routine, ask who benefits. Now I had the answer. She did. Every path, every conversation, every missing letter curved back to her. I set the envelope down carefully, afraid it might crumble in my fingers, and leaned back. The kitchen clock ticked behind me, loud in the empty house. I realized with a chill that this wasn't negligence. It wasn't forgetfulness. It was deliberate, planned, calculated. I grabbed my notebook and started cataloging everything. Dates, names, amounts, every intercepted letter, every bank contact, every postmark. My father had told me to document everything, and I finally understood why. Paper doesn't blink, it doesn't stutter, it doesn't charm you into forgetting what you saw. It just sits there, steady, undeniable. The further I dug, the more the narrative crystallized. She hadn't stumbled into secrecy. She had engineered it. She intercepted estate mail. She concealed notices. She opened accounts and moved funds under my nose. She researched mineral rights and initiated conversations with bankers. And then she pressured me to sign documents that would have given her control of everything. It was betrayal, yes. But worse, it was betrayal wrapped in domestic routine. Pancakes on a Saturday morning. A kiss at night. A sigh of exasperation when I hesitated. All of it rehearsed, calculated, measured against what she thought I wouldn't notice. By dawn, the table was covered with piles of evidence, sorted into neat stacks. I didn't confront her. Not yet, because anger could wait. Proof couldn't. I made copies of every page, tucking the originals back into the folder so she wouldn't know what I had seen. I scanned documents onto a flash drive and hid it in the garage, taped under the workbench. I locked the envelope from my father in a fireproof box and carried it with me everywhere, even to the shower. If she wanted to erase the past, she was going to have to get through me first. And in those hours, something shifted inside me. The fear that had weighed on me for weeks burned away, replaced by something colder, sharper. A resolve that came not from rage, but from clarity. I wasn't stumbling anymore. I wasn't guessing. I knew. She had tried to rewrite my inheritance into her story, but now I had the real manuscript. And when the time came, her words would collapse against my father's, against the truth that could not be uninked. I didn't confront her yet, I fortified. The letter had given me proof. The folder had given me motive. Now I needed leverage, and for that, I needed a lawyer who could see what I saw. By the time I gathered the papers into neat stacks, the sun had begun to edge through the curtains. Light fell across the kitchen table, illuminating the evidence of her betrayal like a crime scene. I sat there with bloodshot eyes, exhausted but strangely calm. I wasn't just a husband doubting his wife anymore. I was a man holding proof. But proof alone isn't enough. Proof has to be placed into the right hands, framed by the right voice, protected by the right walls. My father's letter had reminded me of that. Paper is memory that can't be sweet-talked, but paper without protection is just tinder. So I picked up the phone. The first call I made was to the law office listed in my father's instructions. The receptionist answered with a bright, polite voice. But when I gave my name, there was a pause, like a file drawer had just been yanked open in the background. Within minutes, I was transferred to a man named Richard Hale. He was older, steady, the kind of lawyer who didn't waste words. "I was instructed to contact you," I said, trying to keep my voice level. By my father. Robert's son, he replied immediately, his tone firm, but not unkind. I've been expecting your call. Later than I thought, but expected. The weight of that sentence pressed into my chest. Expected. As if my father had prepared him too. I scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. Until then, I moved like a man in enemy territory. She made breakfast, smiled, and asked me if I'd seen the documents she left on the nightstand. I forced myself to nod, forced myself to swallow eggs that tasted like ash, forced myself to smile back. Inside, I was counting the hours until I could place the truth into Richard's hands. When I walked into his office, I felt the same nerves I had felt opening the safe. A part of me still wondered if I was making too much of this, if maybe grief had sharpened shadows into monsters. But when Richard spread the papers across his desk, adjusted his glasses, and began to read, the look in his eyes told me I hadn't imagined a thing. He took his time, flipping through statements, running a finger along margins, jotting notes in a sharp, angled script. I didn't rush him. I just sat there, my heart pounding with every page he turned. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and laced his fingers together. Your father was thorough, very thorough, and it's a good thing he was. What you've brought me here is a paper trail of concealment, possible fraud, and at minimum interference with estate correspondence. If we act quickly, we can get ahead of this. Get ahead of it? I asked. Richard nodded. Freeze. Secure. Preserve. Those are the 3 steps. First, we freeze any attempt to transfer or tamper with your inheritance. That means immediate notice to the trustee and the bank. Second, we secure your evidence copies, originals, chain of custody. Third, we preserve the record by filing preliminary motions so that if she tries to claim ignorance later, the court sees through it. It sounded like war. And, in a way, it was. What about her? I asked, my throat tight. He studied me. We don't confront her, not yet. We let her walk herself into the story she's been writing, and then we show the court the real manuscript. If she's been intercepting mail, pushing you to sign, and filing things under her name, then she's left fingerprints all over this. Well, bring them into the light. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't alone. My father's foresight and Richard's strategy formed a wall on either side of me, and I stood in the middle, no longer defenseless. We spent hours building the case. Richard made copies of the trust, documents, highlighted the clauses that protected me, and flagged the letters that had been stolen. He advised me to start journaling times, dates, every conversation I had with her about paperwork. A journal is testimony the court respects, he said. It shows you were paying attention. By evening, I left the office with a folder thicker than when I arrived, my mind buzzing with both dread and determination. Richard had promised to file motions by the next morning. Once we serve her, he said, shall know the game has changed. Driving home, I kept glancing at the passenger seat, where my father's letter sat inside its envelope, tucked in the same jacket pocket I had carried it in the night I found it. The words, "If you are reading this later than you should have, it is because someone made sure you did," kept pulsing through me. But now, for the first time, I wasn't just reacting. I was preparing. That night at home, she was all warmth and ease. She poured wine, leaned close, and laughed at some story on the television. It was a performance, and I almost admired the smoothness of it. But as I looked at her, I thought of the intercepted envelopes, the forged conversations, the mineral rights she had been circling like a hawk. She thought she was 2 steps ahead. She didn't realize my father had left me the map, and Richard had sharpened the compass. I nodded when she talked, smiled when she teased, and let her believe her mask was still intact. Inside, I was setting bricks into place. By the time I lay in bed beside her, staring at the ceiling while she scrolled through her phone, I felt an unfamiliar calm. Not the numb calm of denial, but the steel calm of someone who has shifted from prey to opponent. I wasn't cornered anymore. I wasn't fumbling in the dark. I had counsel, I had evidence, I had leverage. All that remained was the truth out loud. The truth wouldn't stay hidden much longer. The kitchen table would become a battlefield before the courtroom ever did. And when I placed my father's letter in front of her, she wouldn't be able to laugh it away. I chose the kitchen because the kitchen never lies. Everything is bright there, light on steel, light on glass, light on the face across from you. I set 2 mugs on the table and boiled water like it was any other evening. She came in smiling, barefoot, scrolling her phone. I slid a cup toward her and placed a manila envelope beside it. "Tea?" I asked. "Sure," she said, glancing at the envelope. "What's that?" "Paperwork," I said. "The kind you like." I sat down and set 3 things between us: my father's letter, the copies in a sleeve, and the receipt for the safe with my name at the top. Her eyes flicked over them, the smile faltering. "What is this?" she asked. "Truth," I said. I began with the receipt. "This is the safe you've been visiting. You registered it in my name. Here's the spare combination card, my handwriting." She tried to be confused. "That's just old storage. We used it for insurance papers." "No," I said. "You intercepted mail. You opened notices meant for me. You discussed my inheritance with a banker." Her tone softened. "You're paranoid." I was helping. "Helping yourself," I cut in, sliding the mineral rights letter toward her. "This confirms it." She tried pleading, then anger, then silence. Finally, I slid my father's letter across the table and read aloud. "If you are reading this later than you should have, it is because someone made sure you did." Her eyes locked on the page. She couldn't look away. "You think this will hold up?" she snapped, desperation creeping in. "It already has," I said. "The trustee, the bank, the court, they've all been notified. Everything here is copied and preserved. We won't be handling this in this kitchen." The mask slipped completely. Her face drained, calculation stripped of charm. "You're going to ruin us," she whispered. "No," I said, standing. "You already did. I'm just turning on the lights." I gathered the papers, slid the letter back inside my jacket, and left her staring at the empty table. The next conversation would happen in a room with a gavel. The courthouse smelled of paper and polish. I walked in with my father's letter pressed flat inside my jacket, every step echoing with the weight of what was about to happen. She was already there, calm and polished beside her lawyer. She even smiled at me, like this was still her game to win. Her lawyer went first, painting her as the dutiful wife, claiming I was grieving, confused, too fragile to handle finances. He said she stepped up out of love. His words were smooth, practiced, but Richard leaned forward and whispered, "Patience." When it was our turn, Richard laid out the evidence. The receipt for the safe in my name, the spare combination card in my handwriting, the envelopes addressed to me but opened by her, the banker's letter confirming her secret inquiries. Finally, he placed my father's inheritance letter before the judge. The judge read carefully, lips tightening as she scanned the line. "If you are reading this later than you should have, it is because someone made sure you did." She looked up sharply. "Mrs., did you intercept this mail?" Her lawyer tried to spin it as household management, But then Richard produced the last page, the one with her maiden name listed beside inquiry, estate correspondence. The courtroom fell silent. Her face drained of color. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The judge spoke firmly. The inheritance and mineral rights are the sole property of the petitioner. The prenuptial agreement is void due to fraud and nondisclosure. Half the marital assets are awarded to the petitioner, and the respondent will pay attorney fees. The gavel struck. Done. I rose, took the letter from Richard, and slipped it back into my jacket. She watched me with wide, broken eyes, her mask finally gone. For once, she had no words. The gavel had fallen. The truth was out. The courtroom had gone quiet, but silence doesn't last. Truth leaks. By the time I walked out of the courthouse, the aftershocks had already begun. Friends whispered. Some offered sympathy, others avoided me. Her friends defended her at first, but even they couldn't explain the safe, the letters, the evidence. Paper doesn't lie, and paper had spoken. At home, she went through phases. Rage came first, accusations, slammed doors, claims that I had ruined her life. Then came nostalgia, pleading for the past, reminding me of happier times. Finally, desperation. "If you ever loved me, don't tell anyone else what was in that letter," she begged one night. I looked her in the eye and said, "If you ever loved me, you wouldn't have hidden it." That was the end. She moved her things out in boxes, each car door slam echoing like punctuation. The lawyers handled the rest. The community kept talking, but I no longer felt small. I no longer felt cornered. I felt free. My father had left me more than an inheritance. He had left me foresight, clarity, and the strength to say no. She wanted secrecy, but I chose the truth. And for the first time in years, I felt worthy of my own story. The aftershocks didn't break me. They rebuilt me. And yet, there was one last thing I had to do. One last place I had to visit. The safe where it all began. Weeks after the gavel fell, life finally felt calmer. The courtroom battles were over, the lawyers moved on, and the whispers around town began to fade. But one thing still lingered in my mind. The safe. The place where everything had started, and the place where everything had changed. I couldn't leave it unfinished. That box had once held all the power my inheritance, my father's words, the secrets she thought I would never see. It was more than steel and numbers now. It was a reminder. One evening, as the sky turned dark and the streets grew quiet, I drove back to Westfield Security. The building looked the same as before, plain, industrial, unremarkable, but it felt different this time. The first time I came here, I was trembling with fear, terrified of what I might find. Now, my steps were steady. I wasn't chasing answers anymore. I was claiming them. The brass key fit perfectly. The heavy door groaned open, and my footsteps echoed down the long corridor. I stopped at my safe, placed my hand on the cool metal, and let the memories wash over me. The first night, the sweat on my palms, the pounding in my chest, the fear that maybe she had stolen everything already. And then the relief when I opened it and saw my father's handwriting waiting for me. I spun the dial, left, right, left. The tumblers fell into place and the lock clicked. The door opened with a soft, metallic groan. Inside, it was nearly empty now. I'd already taken the folder, the letters, the evidence that changed everything. Still, staring into that hollow space, I felt its weight. This wasn't just a container for paper, it was the vault that held the truth. It was the very thing she thought she had under her control. But the whole time, it had been mine. I pulled the envelope from my jacket pocket. My father's letter. The paper was softer at the edges now, worn from being carried close to my heart. But the ink was still bold, his handwriting still strong. I unfolded it slowly and read his words again. The warnings, the instructions, the reminders about worth. Son, you are not measured by what you sign away, but by what you stand to protect. That line landed differently this time. Back then, I was desperate for evidence. Now, I understand it as a lesson. My father hadn't only protected my inheritance, he had protected me. I read the letter all the way through, letting my voice fill the quiet room. It felt like speaking to him across time, like he was there with me, nodding, steady, proud. When I finished, I folded it carefully, pressed it against my chest for a moment, and slid it back into my jacket. Then I placed my hand on the door of the safe and closed it one last time. The lock clicked shut, final and certain. But this time, it didn't feel like closing a door on secrets. It felt like closing a door on the past. I walked out into the night air. It was crisp, clean, and cool, as if the world itself had been waiting for me to let go. I took a deep breath and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. She had hidden the inheritance letter. She had stolen mail, forged conversations, and nearly stolen my future. But she forgot one thing. The safe was always mine.